Student debt at the Supreme Court this week, and the oral arguments transpired on Tuesday. It went pretty much as you would expect, Ryan.
Yeah, let's put this first one up there. This is a challenge, and we talked about this, we previewed this yesterday on the show. This is a challenge to the Biden plan to cancel $10,000 in student debt for everybody making under $125,000, cancel $20,000 for anybody who was getting Pell Grants, which makes you more in need of financial support. How much were you able to listen to? I caught some of the arguments back and forth, went on for a couple hours.
It was basically exactly what I expected to hear from the Supreme Court. Some, interesting questions from Amy Coney Barrett, who actually asked whether, she seemed to be questioning whether some of the Republican states who brought this challenge to the Biden law had the standing to bring the lawsuit, which is a huge question at play here. This is the Attorneys General of Nebraska and Missouri. They were arguing the law is meant to allow, this is the HEROES Act, which is kind of at the center of all of this. The Biden administration argued the HEROES Act allowed them to do the debt forgiveness plan. Republican states are saying that's ridiculous, and it rests on this word necessary. And Republicans are saying to argue that it was necessary in a pandemic emergency to forgive student loan debt actually is absurd on its face, because you could have taken X, Y, and Z other steps to mitigate the problems of student loan debt. So there's a lot hinging on that word necessary. I did think Amy Coney Barrett was interesting that she questioned the standing issue. John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh seemed to be pretty opposed on the grounds that it was a spectacular use of power or would constitute an expansion of power. Kavanaugh had a great quote where he said some of the biggest mistakes in the court's history were deferring to assertions of executive or emergency power. And I say that's a great quote because whether or not you agree with it, it really crystallizes, I think, where the conservative justices might be coming from on this issue.
And I think the White House Solicitor General did a good job of making the counter argument, but I'm not sure it's going to matter,
right?
Because this might just come down as a partisan ruling. But her point was, if you read the statute, and you can look at the Higher Education Act, which they could also justify it under, and the way that John Roberts did with ACA and kind of rewrote the justification for it.
That's a good point.
You could do that.
Yes.
But she also argued for it under the HEROES Act, which says, basically, in a national emergency, the executive is given by Congress the authority to modify, waive, cancel, etc., these particular benefit programs as a result of an emergency. So her point is, like, this is not executive authority. This is congressional authority. And if you don't allow the administration to do this, then you're actually restricting congressional power, because Congress very explicitly wanted to write into the law flexibility for the executive to operate in a time of crisis. And as she pointed out, precisely as President Trump did at the very beginning of the pandemic. Yes. There was a crisis. He implemented a pause, which, as she also rightly pointed out, cost much more money to the federal government than the Biden plan would. That one was hundreds of billions, maybe even a year. And nobody was suggesting that was unconstitutional. Nobody took it to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court didn't pause it. And so her point is that now that you've done this, as you're coming out of the emergency, you have to find a way to kind of resolve and get back into a state of normal affairs. So the idea that it would be completely legal and constitutional to pause all student loan payments, but not constitutional and not legal to figure out a way to kind of ease out of that as the crisis ends, would be telling Congress that they don't have the power to grant the executive that flexibility to fix something like that, which actually does then hamstring Congress, because then Congress Congress can't write laws that the executive is able to follow if the Supreme Court can come in and say, well, this is actually a really big number, because that was the thing that a lot of the justices were harping on.
Roberts in particular,
Like, this is such a huge number. And as the White House was pointing out, yeah, we're like a $20 trillion economy. Like, when these agencies do something over a 10-year window, it's going to cost in the billions of dollars.
And this is what Sonia Sotomayor says. She says, quote, "It's an outrageous sum. It's not a question of money. It's a question of Congress's intent." Now, Ilya Shapiro in City Journal, I think, broke down the argument the government is making. He disagrees with it, obviously, but he sort of walked through the logics. He's saying the government's lawyers now make the following assertions before the Supreme Court. The pandemic is a national emergency. Every federal student loan borrower either lives in a COVID disaster area or has been otherwise financially affected by that emergency. As a result of that emergency, some borrowers will default on their loans once payments finally resume after a multi-year pause, and then forgiving some or all of the borrower's principal balances will ensure their overall risk of default is no worse than it was before the pandemic. Now, Shapiro, who disagrees with this, Ilya Shapiro writes, that doesn't make a lot of sense because a simpler and more direct method is available. If the government's purpose were truly to reduce the harm of more defaults, it could put borrowers on an income-based repayment plans and even more simply waive some of the legal consequences of missed payments. And I do think that's a very difficult thing for the government to grapple with. In the same way, I think your point makes a lot of sense. And Ilya writes here about how the Trump administration's plan for border wall construction and the Biden vaccine mandate via the OSHA Act both run into the same problems here. And this court has obviously shown a willingness to flex its muscles on executive power a little bit. The HEROES Act is from 2003, and it was passed after 9/11. And so there's a question as to the sort of level of emergency power that's being utilized here. But I do think it also, here's a good question for you. The West Virginia v. EPA ruling comes into play here as well. Is there something to learn from the Supreme Court's ruling in that case, which I don't know if Barrett actually was on the court for, but where do you see it, if you see a point A to B from West Virginia v. EPA to this? I
think it sounds like if a Democratic administration is enacting some type of executive action, then the Supreme Court, this particular Supreme Court, is going to look askance at it. Is going to argue that it's not within their power. I do think it's showing the real partisan nature of this system at this point. By the way, we got Randy Weingarten, who was out in front of the Supreme Court yesterday. Let's roll a little bit of her.
President Biden said, we are going to deal with that. As we deal with the end of the pandemic, we're going to deal with that. We're not going to start student debt again without actually making a down payment of it. And the Secretary of Education had the right to do it. And frankly, and this is what really pisses me off, during the pandemic, we understood that small businesses were hurting. And we helped them. And it didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge it. Big businesses were hurting, and we helped them, and it didn't go to the Supreme Court to challenge it. All of a sudden, when it's about our students, they challenge it, the corporations challenge it, the student loan lenders challenge it. That is not right, that is not fair, and that is what we are fighting as well when we say, cancel student debt. This is about the people, and it is about the people's future, and it is about all of your futures.
I mean, it does feel to me like there's so much more nitpicking of Democratic policies. Like, for Shapiro to say, look, there are other ways that the administration could do this that would satisfy us constitutionally. It's like, okay, cool. Then you win the presidential election and you do it those other ways. But just because there might be a way that you prefer to do it doesn't mean that the other way to do it is unconstitutional. And they also might be careful what they wish for, because instead now they're just going to go back to a pause for everybody.
So his argument is that it's unconstitutional in this case, particularly because the word necessary means that there are no other options, that what is necessary is to just get away with all the debt. And again, I think that's what justices are going to be asking, whether or not necessary is the proper, it necessitates, whether that word in and of itself necessitates the action of sort of broadly canceling 10 to 20,000.
Right, but that would suggest that if there's any other option, then the option that you chose is not necessary because you could have chosen another option. So he could actually make the same argument even if he had picked Shapiro's idea. What the necessary means is that it's necessary to do something. It's a crisis. You've got trillions of dollars in student debt coming out of this pandemic that was paused. We have a giant crisis that we need. Then it's necessary for the administration to do something to fix it. what that something is something that then the regulators they work up a plan. But if just because there are 5 different ways that you could do it, like he could have done 15,000, or he could have done 5,000, so it wasn't necessary to do 10,000. Could have done 15, and so would he then say, well, that's unconstitutional because it wasn't precisely necessary to do 10,000? But yeah, so maybe this ends up actually being good news for all borrowers, because I find it very difficult to believe that the Biden administration is going to, before the 2024 election, say, okay, Supreme Court, fine, we'll just reinstitute all student loan payments. They'll just continue the pause, which began under Trump, and then dare the Supreme Court to say that, okay, this was fine under Trump, but it's actually illegal under Biden, and then let Republicans run in 2024 on, we're going to reinstitute all of your student debt payments by January 2025. Vote for us.
Well, I think this is what's a general problem with Biden that would infuriate me if I had student loan debt on the table, because it's a cowardice. Like, it's just this milquetoast, halfway, third way, maybe I should say, method of approaching student loan debt, where there's no way that the Biden White House did not realize this was going to get hung up in the courts. And so 25 million people of an estimated 40 million who would be eligible for this had already filled out the applications and signed up before this pause hit. 25 million people.
I think 16 million got approved even.
I mean, it's amazing.
The letters that said you're approved.
Of an estimated 40 million in the balance, potential 40 million beneficiaries of a law like this. And so he knew that was going to happen. And there are other ways to do this. Brianna Joy Gray has laid some of them out.
Higher Education Act is pretty clear.
The executive power is on the table. It's the same thing with OSHA. Like, that's why they used an obscure provision in the OSHA Establishing Act to do that. Right. And the executive power is on the table. I don't think it should be in many cases, but I think Joe Biden is a coward for doing the halfway route that would politically look good at the expense of all of these people who are now in the squeeze, whose futures are uncertain, and who have tens of thousands of dollars in some cases on the table, just pending in the court system with no idea where that's going to go and no way to plan.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now, and Sagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us, and if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.